Clifford of Boston College fascinating on male and female. He created them and how it is misused from Genesis. So the Outreach Guide to the Bible and Homosexuality. Now to our distinguished speaker tonight. Outreach from its beginning, i.e. 2 years ago, has long wanted to collaborate, as I hope you know, with all the different LGBTQ organizations. So of course, if you go on Outreach, you'll see articles by Frank DiBernardo and Sister Janine. We have links to New Ways Ministries, wonderful list of welcoming parishes. We love working with our colleagues from places like Fortunate Families and Fortunate and Faithful Families and the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, Dignity. And so we see our mission as part of a family, right? Brian Massengale in his talk this afternoon talked about the image of the relay race, which I think comes from Paul, I guess. And yeah, I'm Catholic after all, so. Anyway, so we're all running the race together. And so what Outreach tries to do, in addition to its own thing, is to try to amplify voices and bring people together and work together. And that's why I'm so happy that we have Marianne Duddy-Burke as our keynote tonight. Marianne Duddy-Burke has led DignityUSA as its executive director since 2007. A graduate of the former Weston Jesuit School of Theology, now the BC School of Theology and Ministry, she was raised in New Jersey and earned a bachelor's degree from Wellesley College in 1982. After joining the Boston chapter of Dignity and attending her first national conference in 1985, Ms. Duddy-Burke became the first female president of Dignity in 1993. She has advised the Religion and Social Justice Advocacy Group, part of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the U.S. State Department, and has written for numerous publications, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the National Catholic Reporter, and the Advocate. Marianne is also the co-chair with Chris Vella, who is here with us, of the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, an international consortium of LGBTQ Catholic groups. I hope that we all know the very important work that Dignity has done, how important it has been historically and today for all LGBTQ people. And also how people in Dignity, including Marianne, have done this work often at great cost. So we are so happy and grateful to have Marianne Duddy-Burke with us tonight.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for that gracious introduction, Jim. And my thanks to the entire team at Outreach for the invitation to keynote this conference, as well as all your coordination and support efforts. It's a profound honor to speak to all of you tonight, and especially to share some of the sacred wisdom gained by the efforts and goodwill of so many who have carried Dignity's mission from the pre-Stonewall days of 1969 to today, and who have no intention of letting our ministry and learning end anytime soon. I speak to you tonight in my role as Executive Director of DignityUSA. But this organization is much more than my employer. As Jim noted, I've been a member of Dignity since 1982, when I attended a Mass at Dignity Boston shortly after my graduation from college, and as I was beginning my graduate studies at Weston Jesuit School of Theology. Having been told during my college years that my lesbianism made me unfit to lead my Newman community, finding a Catholic community that welcomed me and helped me integrate my sexual orientation and my faith felt miraculous. This community has been my faith community for my entire adult life. It's where I met my wife on Easter Sunday, 29 years ago. I mean, how Catholic is that? It's where we married, where our children were baptized. It's where I've met most of the people who are my dearest friends. And it's the community that has accompanied me through major losses and challenges in my life. It's the community that called and has supported me as a minister, allowing me to live out a vocation that I have known that I had since I was a very young child. I know that many of us who are part of Catholic communities for LGBTQ plus Catholics know what a blessing this is in our lives and what a gift it is to find one. It's also important for me to note that in telling Dignity's story and in bringing forth some of what we've learned, there are many moments when things that the institutional church did or did not do caused great harm. I will be talking about some of these. As in our sacred scriptures, the story of God's people is one of attempts to discern truth, the essence of belief, and the will of a mysterious God. Over and over throughout our history, Dignity has held positions different from the institutional teachings of the church, and that's true today. Indeed, I'm sure there are some in our church who find it scandalous that I am speaking at this conference. It is my prayer that they can listen and find some common ground in what I say. We in Dignity have always held precious our faith, our baptism, our membership in the body of Christ, and believe that, like all other Catholics, we have gifts to bring, as well as things to learn from our church. You'll also hear my language about the queer Catholic community change through this talk. And this reflects how our community's sense of ourselves has evolved over time. And finally, I want you all to know that although it is my voice that you hear, this presentation draws on the insights and witness of literally thousands of people. What you'll hear tonight is storytellings and learning that result from my reflections on two sources of insights. First, for nearly 2 years preceding DignityUSA's 50th anniversary celebration in 2019, our entire organization engaged in a Jubilee period. Our national board invited everyone associated with Dignity to engage in personal and communal reflection on our history, our present, and our dreams for our future. During each one of these stages, every community across Dignity was invited to hold listening sessions, given questions to guide their conversations, and they submitted reports on what they heard, including direct quotes from the participants. We also held online sessions so that people who were unaffiliated with a chapter or a caucus or who couldn't attend a local session had the chance to participate. Over 84% of Dignity communities and members took part in this effort. And then a team of national board members and staff read every one of these reports and compiled an executive summary of each phase. So all of these reports, including the summary documents, are preserved on our website. and this made it easy for me to review what was important to our members and to draw on the broadest range of perspectives in thinking about what we've learned. Beyond that, when I was invited to do this talk, I asked dozens of Dignity leaders, people who have given, in many cases, decades of their lives to ensuring that our ministry is available to all who need it, as well as some of our newer members and leaders, to share their thoughts on lessons learned with me. They responded generously, articulately, and with a palpable love for their faith and community. It is impossible for me to describe their contributions as anything other than scripture. So, with gratitude to all those whose thoughts and lives have inspired this talk, let us turn now to consider just a few of the many lessons learned from the salvation history compiled over 54 years of Dignity to date. In the beginning was shame and isolation. These were the needs that spurred the birth of Dignity. In the late 1960s, our founder of recent blessed memory, Father Patrick Neidorff, later Pax Neidorff, was an Augustinian priest based in San Diego. Father Pat shared this story of what inspired him to begin a ministry for gay Catholics. The gay people whom I met were frequently bothered by ethical problems and identity with the church. It seemed obvious that the church wasn't meeting the needs of the gay community. In counseling gay Catholics, there always seemed to be an excessive and unreal problem of guilt that was sometimes reinforced in the confessional instead of being resolved. With these ideas rattling around in my brain, I wrote a paper on a proposed group for Catholic gays and presented it to our members at a provincial meeting. Most of the priests seemed to favor the idea of forming such a group, and I did. Patrick's proposal got approval late in 1968, and in the early months of the following year, about a dozen lesbians and gay men started meeting for prayer, Bible study, and sometimes Mass in a home in San Diego. As our archives document, since Father Pat doesn't want religious fanatics or homophobics to disrupt or dominate meetings, he requires the return of a completed application form, and when in doubt, a personal interview. He charges $5 a year for participation and requires that all be 21 years of age and have a membership card, which he issues. The monthly gatherings are closed to anyone else. When I hear Pope Francis talk about the ministry of accompaniment, Father Pat's work in these early days often springs to mind. He demonstrated a clear understanding of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and ally Catholics longing to remain connected with their faith and their church, to do so in a space where they did not face condemnation, and perhaps most importantly, where they could be safe from the very real threats they faced in everyday life. So lesson number one, the needs and realities of those being served must drive any ministry. In this case, the need to know God's unconditional love, to be in supportive spiritual community, to know that we have a place in the church that we love and that claimed us in baptism, to find sanctuary from social and religious oppression were recognized and met, and the ministry thrived. As we will move on, we'll see that living by lesson number one, as Dignity has tried to do throughout all of these decades, has had consequences. consequences that are sometimes hard to accept, but that must be acknowledged and addressed for this ministry to be authentic. By 1970, Dignity was meeting mostly in Los Angeles, as interest from that city exceeded the number of folks who were gathering in San Diego. Father Pat had started advertising the group's existence in the Advocate and the Los Angeles Free Press. Due to the group's growth, meeting in homes was no longer feasible, at least in LA. So in September of 1970, St. Brendan's of Los Angeles opened its doors for Dignity to meet in the parish hall. The group was so excited by this welcome that they urged Father Pat to write to the Archdiocese to explain his ministry and Dignity's beliefs and purposes. These had been outlined in a first draft of an organizational statement of position and purpose drafted by Bob Fournier, an early lay leader. The statement said, in part, "We believe that homosexuality is a natural variation on the use of sex. It implies no sickness or immorality. Those with such sexual orientation have a natural right to use their power of sex in a way that is both responsible and fulfilling, and should use it with a sense of pride." Although this language was tweaked as our statement of position and purpose was reviewed and revised by Dignity members and leaders, it was very bold, provocative, and forward-thinking language for 1970. What ultimately was adopted read, "We believe that gay, lesbian, and bisexual persons can express their sexuality in a manner consistent with Christ's teaching." Still quite prophetic. So Pat thought that contacting diocesan officials was not prudent. But he gave in eventually to what he described as continual prodding and sent a letter off in early 1971. Very shortly thereafter, Pat and his provincial were summoned to meet with Los Angeles Coadjutor Archbishop Timothy Manning. And by the conclusion of that meeting, Pat had been ordered to stop his ministry. 9 days later, he announced his resignation at Dignity's monthly potluck and meeting in LA, which was attended by about 90 people. The group responded with despair at first, but after a speech by Bob Fournier, decided to continue on as a lay-led ministry. Even as what would prove to be a momentous transition in leadership was occurring, it became clear that there was strong interest in Dignity across the country. The ads that Father Pat had placed were being seen by folks traveling to LA, as well as by Advocate subscribers around the country, and even beyond, including the Philippines, Australia, Canada, the West Indies, England, Holland, and Switzerland. Letters were flowing into the address listed in the ad, and a small group of the original members replied to every one of them, providing their phone numbers to follow up. I'm sure they wished for internet connection at that point. Early members report spending dozens of hours each month on the phone or writing letters to those who had made inquiries, hearing their stories, and eventually trying to help them get Dignity communities started wherever they were. And in November of 1971, Dignity Louisville, Kentucky, was organized as the first chapter outside of Southern California. Let's think for a moment. Here are people scorned by family, church, and society, who are labeled and often think of themselves as sick, sinful, and criminal. Yet just as the early church was led by really unpromising characters, they became the apostles who spread out across the land, planting the seeds of good news for gay, lesbian, and bisexual Catholics based on breaking open the Word of God and sharing the Eucharist. So this leads to lesson number 2. Affirming spiritual community is healing. It can transform shame to generous purpose, instill a sense of giftedness, and turn pariahs into ministers. Isn't that what we see in every LGBTQ+ ministry? There is miraculous grace in recognizing, in naming, in affirming wholeness and holiness. And over time, we see people beginning to become fully alive, living into who they were created with the potential to be. In those early years, Dignity grew quickly, with the officers and volunteers providing long-distance support and sometimes traveling at their own cost to places where people were meeting under the name and model of Dignity. Gay Catholics from Canada and Australia traveled to the US to meet with Dignity leaders and set up groups in their countries. Australia's group Acceptance is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. As these groups formed, many members and leaders believed it was important to reach out to local Catholic leaders, including their own pastors, priests from religious orders, religious women's communities, and in some cases, bishops, to let them know about Dignity and ask for their support. Certainly this didn't happen everywhere, but in more than a few instances where this occurred, the groups met with some significant support. Father John McNeil, then a Jesuit, agreed to allow Dignity to reprint his writing, meaning that some of the first Catholic theology to argue for inclusion and respect for gay people, as well as a more inclusive and positive sexual ethic, was reaching thousands of people. Priests offered their services as presiders and to provide pastoral counseling and the sacraments. Nuns and priests became active members of Dignity communities, sometimes openly and sometimes incognito. Churches, chapels, and Newman centers served as meeting places. In some dioceses, bishops collaborated with Dignity by appointing chaplains or developing what was then called gay and lesbian ministries. Some bishops even presided at Dignity liturgies annually or a few times a year. Dignity members and some church officials became leaders in early attempts to gain human rights protections for lesbian and gay people. Some Catholic charities organizations, Catholic hospitals, and Catholic colleges were among the first organizations in the US to add sexual orientation to their employment non-discrimination policies. In 1974, the National Federation of Priests Council adopted a motion to support full civil rights for gay people and called for the decriminalization of consensual same-sex relationships. The following year, Dignity helped shape a presentation to the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, urging them to condemn discrimination, support civil rights, and assist Dignity in its pastoral outreach to gay and lesbians. Dignity's delegates to the 1976 U.S. Bishops' Call to Action Conference, including Janine Gramick, succeeded in getting 4 pro-gay resolutions passed. Many other Dignity efforts helped drive Catholic leadership for equality and inclusion in that first decade after Stonewall. One of my favorite stories is Dignity leaders in California working to get every diocese to agree to place a full-page ad in its diocesan paper, urging Catholics to defeat the Briggs Amendment in 1978. The Briggs Amendment would have made it illegal for gay men or lesbians to serve as teachers, aides, counselors, or administrators in public schools. It failed. I think it's important to remind ourselves of this history, or to educate ourselves if we did not witness it or were not aware of it. The current tension in our church around LGBTQ+ issues was not always so evident, and the initial support for our community can be a source of hope. So here is lesson number 3. The first impulse of Catholicism is to be supportive of LGBTQ+ people. I believe this reflects the core principles of our faith, which are love, justice, and community. We Catholics believe with every fiber of our being that every person is loved into being by God, and that each of us has inherent dignity that must be respected. We speak of ourselves as being members of the body of Christ, and we long for that body to be whole and healthy. These convictions have fueled Dignity, as well as other ministries serving LGBTQ+ people, family members, and allies for decades, and we must hold on to those truths. But we live in a big church and in a world that holds evil as well as grace. So alongside the blessings of love and inclusions, we humans, we Catholics, also experience fear, jealousy, anger, desire for power, and other impulses that can lead to inequity and discrimination. So while there was a great deal of support for dignity and for lesbian and gay equality from the church in the early 1970s and even into the early 80s, that certainly was not a universal reality in the US. Concerns about acceptance of homosexuality were raised quite early in Rome. In late 1975, the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published a document expressing grave concerns about changing social mores on sex and equality. That document stated, quote, "No pastoral method can be employed which would give moral justification to homosexual acts." It added, "In sacred scripture, they are condemned as a serious depravity and even condemned as the sad consequence of rejecting God." This thinking and language were seized on by many people, including some bishops, Catholics uncomfortable with the rising gay liberation movement, and others who used it as authoritative condemnation of any same-sex intimacy, and as a way to raise questions about the legitimacy of Dignity and other ministries to the lesbian and gay community. As the 1970s end and the 1980s began, there were dark clouds apparent on the horizon for Dignity. A few dioceses began to ban priests from presiding for Dignity liturgies, mostly by saying that separate liturgies for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people were not necessary and divided the church. Catholic officials started to testify against the expansion of equal rights laws to include sexual orientation at municipal and statewide public hearings. The papacy of John Paul II began to emphasize doctrinal orthodoxy, and he was seen as very conservative on issues of gender, sexuality, and family, and he censured theologians whose work questioned official church teaching. In addition, starting in 1981, Dignity members became deeply concerned about outbreaks of what was then termed the gay disease. In cities and in small towns across the US and across the world, men who had sex with men started becoming ill with a similar series of symptoms, and many died quite quickly. As what is now known as the HIV/AIDS epidemic spread, there was little known about the cause or transmissibility of this very frightening and nearly almost always fatal disease. Staff at many hospitals and other medical facilities and funeral homes were fearful. They didn't know what caused these unknown symptoms. Some refused to work with people who had symptoms consistent with this disease. Others dressed in full hazmat suits when entering the rooms of people with AIDS. Patients were often left in filth for hours. Food was left outside their doors. Some chaplains refused to enter the rooms to provide spiritual support. The bodies of some people known or suspected to have died of AIDS-related issues were placed in trash bags and left on loading docks. Some funeral homes refused to provide services for these people and their families. In the wake of all of this, it fell largely to the personal networks of people with AIDS to care for them. Dignity communities around the country were among those on the front lines. And the fact that we were organized often made us a touchstone for desperate folks we'd never encountered before. Dignity members found themselves in hospitals, hospices, and homes, providing hands-on care, companionship, nourishment, laundry and cleaning services, spiritual care, and yes, even funerals for literally thousands of people, some of whom were our lovers, partners, friends, community members. We were often with parents, siblings, grandparents, and other loved ones as they learned their son was gay and did not have long to live, or often worse, had died too ashamed or fearful to share these secrets with their families. Sorry. As we lived through the months and then years of this pandemic that many political, medical, and religious institutions failed to even acknowledge or named as punishment for perversion, we also became advocates, pushing all of these power centers to respond to this overwhelming and tragic suffering and loss. Our members were leaders in ACT UP, in the National Catholic AIDS Network, and in countless local and state faith-based and advocacy groups. We negotiated the trauma of both individual losses and the clear realization that our lives, the lives of men who had sex with men, no matter how they identified, the lives of sex workers, addicts, and even infected children were considered expendable. The price of keeping good people safe. And borrowing a phrase from eminent theologian Mary Hunt, we lived lesson number 4. Ministry means meeting the needs of the world or of your community despite the cost. This is a call to all of us, not just a chosen few. And in those desperate days, we learned that we have within us what is needed to meet the challenge. As the pandemic reached its peak in the number of people infected and dying, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith released the infamous Halloween letter. Officially entitled, Letter to the Bishops of the Catholic Church on the Pastoral Care of Homosexual Persons, this October 1986 document outlines much of what is still official Catholic teaching on homosexuality. It was riddled with language that gay and lesbian people, our families, and many pastoral ministers found offensive, demeaning, and unnecessarily harsh. This letter actually said that the 1975 Vatican statement, while appropriately labeling same-sex relationships as intrinsically disordered, was not clear enough in its characterization of what was termed the homosexual condition itself, which could not be considered neutral or even good. The 1986 letter is absolutely clear, stating, although the particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, it is more or less a strong tendency ordered toward an intrinsic moral evil, and thus the inclination itself must be seen as an objective disorder. The document went on to say that when people engage in same-sex activity, quote, they confirm within themselves a disordered sexual inclination which is essentially self-indulgent. Another statement in the document that added to the uproar was in the section where church officials try to refute efforts to expand protection of civil rights for gay and lesbian people. In what was clearly a reference to AIDS, the document says, even when the practice of homosexuality may seriously threaten the lives and well-being of a large number of people, its advocates remain undeterred and refuse to consider the magnitude of the risks involved. The practice of homosexuality, not a virus, and the lack of appropriate public health mobilization was blamed for all these people's deaths. And then a few sentences later, we read, when civil legislation is introduced to protect behavior to which no one has any conceivable right, neither the church nor society at large should be surprised when other distorted notions and practices gain ground and irrational and violent reactions occur. Gay and lesbian people and many others saw this language as tacit support or at least excuses for anti-gay violence. While many would caution that the wording in the document is technical theological language with precise meanings that do not always correspond to popular usage, the reality is that this document was released into the world and read by countless people of diverse backgrounds. It caused immense pain, especially for members of the LGBTQ+ community, at the time of its release and in the decades since. As the text began to circulate, hundreds of Dignity members left our communities, saying that this letter was the last straw for them. They could no longer fight to maintain their affiliation with a church that could say such vile things about us. For their spiritual, emotional, and in some cases physical well-being, they needed to step away. Some joined other faith communities, often the Episcopal Church or Metropolitan Community Church. Some found other spiritual pathways, and some felt so much anger and pain that they rejected any kind of spiritual or religious practice, at least for a period of time. The ruptures in our communities and in many friendships were another source of pain during this very difficult period. Language in the Halloween letter that referenced Catholic groups trying to, quote, pressure the church to change her teachings and advocating for expanded legal protections was widely believed to be directed towards Dignity and some of the other groups around the world that had been inspired by Dignity's growth. 3 decades after the letter's release, a former CDF staffer confirmed this belief. But we didn't have to wait 30 years for the impact to be felt. Another part of the CDF letter directed bishops to ensure that ministry to gay and lesbian people was developed and run by ministers who deeply understood and upheld church teaching on sexuality and marriage. It then stated, all support should be withdrawn from any organizations which seek to undermine the teaching of the church, which are ambiguous about it, or which neglect it entirely. Such support, or even the semblance thereof, can be gravely misinterpreted. Special attention should be given to the practice of scheduling religious services and to the use of church buildings by these groups, including the facilities of Catholic schools and colleges. Oops. 6 weeks after the publication of the Halloween letter, the first eviction of a Dignity chapter that met at a Catholic church occurred when Dignity Syracuse was told 2 weeks before Christmas that it was no longer welcome to use that space. In quick succession, Dignity communities in Atlanta, Brooklyn, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Minneapolis, Nassau, New York, Pensacola, Richmond, Suffolk, Vancouver, British Columbia, and Washington, D.C. were forced from their homes. Dozens of expulsions followed as the months went on. In some cases, the pastor or a member of the chancery staff offered Dignity members a choice. They could continue to meet at the church if they renounced Dignity's statement of position and purpose. The fact that not a single chapter accepted this offer is a fact which the Dignity community takes great pride in. Evicted chapters and chapters that suspected they were soon to face eviction quickly reached out to other faith communities in their areas, and almost all found gracious welcome in Congregational, Episcopal, Lutheran, Methodist, Metropolitan Community, Presbyterian, and Unitarian churches. In many cases, Dignity members creating meaningful rituals as they left their former spaces. In some cases, shaking dirt off their shoes. And they processed to their new homes, lifting high candles and sacred items, and being met and embraced by the leaders and members of their new homes. As I'm sure all of you can understand, this was an excruciatingly painful period for Dignity. Between the losses we sustained due to AIDS, those who left due to the Halloween letter, and those who chose to remain in their parishes as they could not tolerate the thought of worshiping in another space, Dignity lost at least a third of our members during this time. But for those who remained with the organization, we learned one of our most surprising and sustaining lessons. Lesson number 5. The church truly is the community, not a building, not the hierarchy. Living out this conviction through the 35 plus years since the Halloween letter has brought unexpected challenges and gifts to the Dignity community, and has led to the lessons that undergird the way our ministry, advocacy, and inclusion work have expanded to today. I do not ever mean to diminish the wrenching pain, anger, and rootlessness that being banned from Catholic facilities has meant to DignityUSA, our chapters, and many of our members. Being told you are not welcome in your home because of who you are, whom you love, and what you believe is a rejection that wounds at many levels. Yet, even in the face of this viscerally intense wound, we have proven our resilience. Again, people who were damaged, in pain, and until then who had been in the background of Dignity communities, stepped up to take on the new responsibilities that arose from this displacement, making new spaces feel as familiar for Catholic liturgy as possible, working with new host community leaders, speaking with the press, helping community members deal with their personal responses to the transitions. For many, public acknowledgement of our church's rejection was a bold act. Most of us in the generations impacted had been raised in an era where church officials were accorded nearly unquestioning respect. Going public with our disagreements with the evictions and with the Halloween letter, to tell our truth, was an assertion of our right to survive and thrive and to find ways of living our faith in forced exile. For Dignity as a movement and organization, we believed that persisting through the AIDS pandemic and the Halloween letter and its aftermath marked us as an Easter people, born into new life after what was seen as our Good Friday. It was the birth of what John McNeill called freedom, glorious freedom, the courage to live our faith in conscience-based conviction. We learned that having no further dependence on the institutional church meant we had the ability to breathe more freely and to speak our truth more boldly. While the hope for full reconciliation with the full church remained, most Dignity members determined that that reconciliation must come with full understanding of and respect for the truth of our lives, our loving, and how who we are impacts how we live our faith. At our first national convening following the release of the Halloween letter, and not before, as many church leaders claimed, our delegates voted overwhelmingly to include explicit affirmation of same-sex intimacy in our statement of position and purpose. At that gathering just outside of Miami in 1987, we added this sentence to our foundational identity document. We believe that we can express our sexuality physically in a unitive manner that is loving, life-giving, and life-affirming. We believe that all sexuality should be exercised in an ethically responsible and unselfish way. Although Dignity had long quietly affirmed sexual intimacy for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, had offered blessings for committed relationships, and even maintained a registry of couples whose commitments had been sanctified by our communities or presiders. And while we had long urged rethinking of dogma on sexuality and relationships in meetings with church leaders and theologians, this official step, this official declaration, was a major step for our organizations and our members. We no longer needed to dance around our beliefs or choose our words carefully. The adoption of this statement was a moment of liberation for us and led to lesson 6. The truth really does set us free, and with freedom comes great responsibility. Once we'd gone on record as formally dissenting from a first official church teaching on homosexuality, we learned a lot about the responsibility that came with having taken that action. Dignity was thrust into and accepted a role of becoming public advocates for a Catholic view on sexuality and relationships that did not have heterosexual marriage and procreation as the only valid ends. This meant learning to articulate principles from our faith, such as mutual benefit of the spouses, the conferring of sacramental marriage by the participants, not the priest, the primacy of conscience, and others, and that we had to put this forward in both the religious and the secular arenas. We became aware of our responsibility to put positive Catholic messages about same-sex intimacy and the truth about the harm that official church teaching was causing into the public square. We realized that we held this responsibility on behalf of people far beyond our own membership. We took on the responsibility of developing a statement of sexual ethics for people who had sex with people of the same gender. We felt compelled to speak as Catholics for the growing number of Catholics who believed in expanding civil rights protections and equality for gay and lesbian people, even as many of our bishops were actively working to defeat such laws. We had to find new ways and resources to make advocacy, both within our church and in the civic arena, as much a part of our mission as spiritual support. In addition, once we were on the record as questioning official church teaching on same-sex issues, we began to grapple with the reality that church teaching may also be unjust in other areas. The equality of women was something we were compelled to explore, largely as a result of increasingly vocal women within our own movement. While women have been a part of Dignity since its earliest days, we were very underrepresented in most communities. Few women held administrative leadership roles in either local chapters or in the national organization. Nearly everywhere, liturgy equaled Mass presided by ordained male presiders, male priests. In some dioceses where priests and officially recognized ministry were completely banned from serving dignity, chapters welcomed married priests, men, officially laicized or not, who had resigned their priesthood to marry women. Dignity's national conventions and regional gatherings offered opportunities for women who were often the only or maybe one of a handful of females in a chapter to connect and share their experiences as Catholics and as Dignity members. The Committee for Women's Concerns started to raise questions about inequity, encouraged Dignity members to study the work of emerging feminist theologians, and promoted the use of inclusive language at Dignity events. Admittedly, some women were so frustrated with their experiences with Dignity or the lack of other resources for them that they founded the Conference of Catholic Lesbians, which offered resources and gatherings that responded to the unique needs of Catholic lesbians. Slowly, we as an organization began to understand the links between misogyny and homophobia, and started to support and work with groups like Women's Ordination Conference, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, WATER, as well as CCL. And we began to expand both liturgical and governance roles that women took on. Beginning to understand interlocking and overlapping oppressions within our church and beyond was an important step that has helped to shape our present and our future. Being more involved with issues of women's equality also forced us to look at issues that arose from being part of a hierarchical church. What assumptions and practices carried over into our organization from being part of a faith that promoted top-down thinking? We strove to be an organization accountable and responsive to our members, but how well were we accomplishing that? These kinds of concerns led us to question many aspects of our church and what it means to be Catholic, especially as what I call an extra-institutional Catholic community. We took on opportunities to learn from theologians, church historians, liturgists, and leaders from other Catholic traditions about how our beliefs and practices were developed and transmitted. We became more invested in discerning what was at the core of our faith and what were trappings we could accept, reject, or reshape. So if you go to a Dignity chapter, you will see a tremendous diversity in how we worship, In some communities, there will still be ordained Catholic priests. Sometimes you will see male and female priests. Sometimes there will be lay people presiding at worship. Sometimes we will have share the word liturgies. In some communities, readings by women occur alongside the canonical scriptures. Our communities will celebrate sacramental marital commitments, hold renaming rituals, baptize children, and people of all identities are invited to all leadership and service roles. Each community must think about its own needs and the resources they have as they determine how they gather and pray together. We believe that we have been living a synodal church for decades. And we believe that deeper engagement with the work of living our faith has made us become even more committed to what we understand as the essentials of Catholicism. And that leads us to lesson 7. Questioning the church can deepen faith. Obviously, it's not true for everyone. But for those who find the grace in the striving to live out the gospel, the transformational power of our sacraments, and the commitment to social justice that has defined Catholicism through the centuries, the commitment to doing our part to building the church we know can exist is strengthened. Another dynamic that our entire community has dealt with is the expanding identity of our community. As bisexual people became more vocal, and then transgender, two-spirit, intersex, asexual, non-binary people broadened our awareness, as queer was embraced by more as an identity, the borders of our community became more elastic. And as a multi-generational community, we need to recognize that generations of LGBTQ people and families have different experiences, different spiritualities, and work to understand and meet those needs. Every time we broaden our sense of who we are, we believe we are introduced to new faces of God, new aspects of a God of unending creativity, and we need to let go of our own comforts, our own rituals, and what has made us happy. We have to be flexible in our ministry. Remember lesson 1? That the needs and realities of those being served must drive ministry? We have found that while it's easier for a smaller group like Dignity than maybe in a large parish or certainly the global church, it's still not easy to give up what is familiar and comfortable. And that brings us to lesson 8. Living into beloved community requires openness to continuous transformation. We have not yet reached the promised land. We probably never will. We're always pilgrims on the way. And now I'd like to just turn to final thoughts about our own potential during this particular moment in time. In our country and in some other parts of the world, the greater visibility and increasing civil protections of LGBTQIA+ people are being met with powerful backlash, both politically and by some in our church. To be clear, we're not the only targets of this hostility. People motivated by the ideas of Christian nationalists and white supremacists, who often overlap, also have Black and brown people, immigrants, Jews, and women in their sights. The scapegoating and targeting of the queer community, especially transgender and non-binary young people, has been particularly virulent and vicious. Many, especially those who feel most vulnerable, may feel they have no option but to hide. But this is no time for us to retreat to our safe upper rooms. The comfort of living in a progressive state or area, the gratitude that we have an LGBTQ ministry to call our spiritual home. It's not a time to protect our privileges. It is not a time to lay low. We need to embrace and claim the wind and fire of Pentecost, not only on ourselves, but for everyone. Our mission to achieve irreversible justice, equality, and full inclusion of LGBTQIA+ people and allies is inextricably linked with all kinds of justice work, happening in many ways and many places. I believe we have learned much about what it means to be a people of Pentecost, being God's unequivocal love for all who need it. In fact, I believe that we as LGBTQIA+ Catholics and allies have a particular call to the work of justice. The justice of everyone is our struggle. LGBTQIA+ people are found in every human demographic possible. We're every age, every race, every ethnicity, every gender. We live in every nation on earth, and we are migrants seeking safety and a place to thrive. We're part of every faith and spiritual tradition and are people who do not believe in any God. We're rich, financially comfortable, and impoverished. We're bodily whole, and we have every physical, emotional, and intellectual disability possible. We're addicts, and we're in recovery. We're imprisoned, and we are unhoused. We are in positions of great power, and we are enslaved and trafficked. We're well educated, and we are people deprived of the opportunity to learn. We serve in militaries, and we're victims of war and uprisings. We're parents, grandparents, siblings, children, and people in need of loving, stable families. Given this reality, it seems to me that LGBTQIA+ Catholics could and should be seen by the larger church as vitally important partners in the work of justice, and even as having unique and special ability to further this mission. We can build and strengthen the body of Christ, helping to unite people by embracing and honoring the diversity of humanity and proclaiming this diversity as an expression of boundless divine creativity. And even if the institutional church takes many more decades to realize and act on this truth, wouldn't it be amazing for us to just take on this work and to bring a new Pentecost to birth? To close this talk, I'd like to invite you all to join in singing a song, and if you're comfortable, in embodying the song in liturgical movement, a song that has become something of an anthem within Dignity. It was written by Dignity Boston member Christine Connors, recorded by members of our chapter, and the dance is led by Kathy Ann Giannino, who was pictured in the very first slide as someone I knew by a pseudonym, as many people were back in the early days of our community. It expresses our hope and our sense of ourselves as a people of mission. I believe it speaks to the goal of LGBTQ+ ministries. With deep appreciation for your attention, I invite you to join me in recognizing that we are prophets to the world.
May our lives of love witness to the truth that our God embraces all. May we join our hands as prophets to
Thank you for that beautiful history. Thank you for sharing with us our history. And thank you for your own personal courage and your witness. Marianne said that I could share this with you. This is the first time that she has spoken in a Catholic church since 1986. And you bless us with your presence. On a much more mundane note, or maybe not so, we are now going to the Wine and Cheese Party, sponsored by Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. It is in new room Schmelzer, which is a very nice room. It is across from Costantino in the law school. For those of you who were here last year, it's where we had most of our meals. It's a very lovely room. So please join us for some wine and cheese and crudités, I am told, thanks to BCSTM. Thank you and have a lovely night.